hope that as you look at the questions around the table, even though you may not know all the people at your table, you'll have a sense of sharing some of your own experience. No requirement, no pressure, but hopefully you'll reflect on your own past as I talk a little bit about some of my experiences. So let me start by mentioning the genesis of the book project. Most of you know, I think, that I retired early from New York Life as president of the company to go off to Yale Divinity School. And it was late in that Divinity School experience that I had dinner with my daughter Dina and her husband Doug. And over dinner I was telling them a number of stories about my life experiences, not all of them faith-based experiences, but a variety of interesting experiences. And I was kind of surprised at how captivated they were by these stories. And at the end of the dinner, my daughter said to me, "Dad, you know, you've told those stories to thousands of New York Life agents and employees, and I'll bet you never, and I don't think you've told most of them to your own family." And that hit me pretty hard because, frankly, it was true. And she then went on to say, "You ought to at least memorialize those in writing for the family." And so I went home that night and I took that to heart and I started to make a list, and I had a list of about 80 topics I could write about. I started to write on those topics. Even though I was in divinity school, in my spare time I was writing these stories. An author friend of mine suggested that I get them published in magazines, so I did have 10 or 12 of them published. But then I connected with a literary agent at Yale through one of the professors at Yale, and she gave me a lot of good advice. And one of the things she said to me was, memoirs of the President of the United States will sell. Memoirs of the President of New York Life will not. And she said, you know, you have to have an underlying theme. You have to have a unifying theme to all these stories. So I took that to heart, and I went back and looked at the list. I hadn't written a lot of stories at that point. And several of them popped up right away as stories in which I felt God's presence palpably in the moment at the time during this particular experience. That was a few stories. Then I went back and looked at the list and I thought, well, maybe that's the common theme. And I started to look at the other stories, and some of the others I thought, you know, based on the circumstances of my life at the time, some of the struggles I was going through, that perhaps God was involved in sending messages and guiding me in those experiences. But then the final exercise, which I think is the most important and probably the key point, is I then decided I'm going to go back and think back through my life experiences, particularly when I was struggling with something. You know, having family issues, problems at work, feeling my job was in jeopardy, dealing with personal failures. And I sort of rewound the tape and replayed it on a number of those situations and asked myself, how did I come out of that? And is it possible God was in it and guiding me and giving me direction? And as it turns out, that was a revelation, because 10 or 12 new stories came up that ended up making the book and were never on the original list of 80 or more. So the theme of the book ended up being God revealed in my life through my experiences, God guiding me, directing me, and helping me. And, you know, therein, I think, lies the value of this book, as Joanne was saying. You know, I believe, I'm sure as many of you do, that there's great power, spiritual power in the telling of stories and the telling of faith stories. So one of the benefits for the reader and the way the book is written is to, not as memoirs, but as my experiences, and then questions are asked at the end of each story and at the end of each chapter to try and get the reader to think about their own past, the way I did when I sort of replayed the tapes. Think about your own past. Think about things that might have happened to you, or you may have overlooked God's presence in your life. And then the next level of benefit comes if the person who does that, and these are personal stories, they're often very emotional, if the person would have the courage to share those stories with others. I think there's no better way to renew spirituality in a church, in a congregation, in your own family, than through faith-based stories and your own experiences. So, as I said earlier, I'm hopeful that as you're served portions of the meal here and you look at the questions, No requirement that you say anything or contribute, but you may think of something that you want to share with the group, and hopefully that will happen.